Today's Zoom with a ZOA webinar is entitled Israel Under Attack, featuring ZOA's representative in Israel, Dan Illouz. I'd like to welcome everyone here in the United States and from around the globe, and a special welcome to those of us joining us from Israel. We support you, we're praying for your safety, and we thank you for accepting the risks inherent in defending Israel, our Jewish homeland. We're hoping to introduce this new series, ZOA Monthly Updates from Israel, by discussing in detail the very important issues surrounding elections in Israel. But with the escalating attacks in Jerusalem and all over Israel, we felt a critical obligation to make sure that our ZOA followers have access to the truth, not the lies and the anti-Israel prejudice distilled by the mainstream media, not the spin generated by the US administration's hostile to Israel appointees. Rather, through our phenomenal, extremely capable, boots on the ground. We will reschedule the webinar about the elections, but candidly, we need to wait as the current escalation is very likely to impact the direction of any future elections and government in Israel. For now, let us address the most important issue facing our Jewish homeland, the current attacks by the enemies of Israel and Israel's absolute right to defend herself. Today, Dan will speak for about 20 minutes, after which he will answer questions. At any time during the webinar, please post your questions to the Zoom Q&A module located at the middle bottom of your screen. I'd like to post a minor disclaimer before we begin. This is ZOA's first webinar using a new Zoom modality, so we ask your indulgence as there may be some learning curve associated with this migration. As mentioned earlier, Dan Illouz is ZOA's representative in Israel. Dan and his wife live in Jerusalem, not far from the rioting we will be discussing. Originally from Montreal, Canada, Dan moved to Israel after studying and specializing in international law at McGill University. Dan worked in the International Law Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He worked as a legislative advisor to the Likud in the Knesset and in senior management positions in Israel's third sector. And Dan serves as an international law advisor to the IDF in reserve duty. Dan has proven to be an invaluable asset to ZOA over the course of this past year, building our ZOA footprint in Israel, helping orchestrate our massive sovereignty efforts, speaking to MKs, and helping to bring many high-profile guests to our online programming. Dan, you're included in those I thanked earlier. As you know, we, your colleagues in the US, continue to support you and pray for your safety. And would you please now share with our listeners the truth about what's happening in Israel? Dan, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Alan. Before I start, I'll just re-emphasize something that Alan said. We're hoping to have this monthly program where we bring you the issues that are affecting Israel in a live way, direct where I can bring you Israel to your bedroom or to your wherever you are. Unfortunately, yesterday, as I was preparing for today's webinar, and I will share my screen as I say these things. As I was preparing for today's webinar, I heard a siren in my home. I live in Jerusalem, and to be honest, sirens in Jerusalem don't happen very often. Even during Tzuk Eitan, the various operations in Gaza, rockets didn't usually come to Jerusalem, only very rarely. But this time we had 7 different rockets hit Jerusalem, and we all went into our protected places in our homes. This is when I understood that we really needed to change the subject for today's discussion and really focus on what has been called by Israel Operation Guardian of the Walls. Guardian of the Walls, referring to the walls of Jerusalem, because this is really an operation which, while it's happening mostly in Gaza, the source of the conflict which led to the operation is really in Jerusalem. And this is basically what we'll be discussing today, so I'm not going to go right now into more details. I do want to map out a little bit what I want to do in the short time that I have with you. I want to do 4 different steps, and then a 5th step, which I'll tell you already, which is questions and answers. If you have any questions, then you can send them in the chat. The first thing is I want to discuss what has happened in the last 24 hours. To be honest, I'm in Israel for the past 13 years, and I haven't seen since moving to Israel 24 hours that were as violent as the last 24 hours. Some really bad things happened in the last 24 hours. Thank God it didn't translate into people being killed, but the amount of violence and incitements that exists is quite unique, and I'll discuss that in the first part. The second part is to really understand how it all started and how we got to where we are now. I'm not going to discuss the sources of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I will discuss about how we got to this point right now, to the tensions that we're talking about right now. Then we'll discuss a little bit about how Israel has started to respond, and then we'll discuss a few myths and facts in order to refute some of the false accusations which have already started appearing on social media and also in the mainstream news. So let's get started with what has happened in the last 24 hours. All of these are pictures that were taken in the last 24 hours. I'm going to start with the top left. There you see people from the eastern parts of Jerusalem, Arabs living in Jerusalem, that are rioting against Israeli police forces in the area of Sha'ar Shrem. Of all of the pictures that you see in this slide, this is the only one that I can say that is not unique to yesterday. When we'll discuss the sources of the tension today, then you'll see that these types of riots have already started since a few weeks ago. And so they just continued yesterday. They were more violent, but we're already dealing with them for the past few weeks. The second picture that you see, if you go a little bit on your right, over here, you see an attempted lynch against someone who was they threw rocks at him, tried to take him out of the car and to really lynch him. And the only reason why he's still alive, thank God, is because of this heroic police officer that you can see on the left of the picture that went in, took his gun out and protected him. If not, then that person would probably be dead right now. And this is something that happened yesterday next to the old city. By the way, if we're talking about myths and facts and disinformation, I saw on the news that some news places have reported this as an attempted ramming by an Israeli of Palestinian passengers. It's completely false. You can see the full video. You can see that he was being thrown rocks at, and only because of that, his car ended up on the sidewalk the way you see it here. The third picture is a picture that, to be honest, as a Jew, it really hurts my heart because it reminds us the stories of Tisha B'Av. You can see a fire on the Temple Mount that happened yesterday. Again, there were riots on the Temple Mount, and the Arabs in the Temple Mount used fireworks in order to try and they sometimes use fireworks as weapons also, and that also caused a fire. One of the trees on the Temple Mount caught fire, and this is a really heartbreaking picture that you see over there. We'll go, all of this happened in Jerusalem. We'll go on the one row to the bottom in order to see some things that happened also outside of Jerusalem. The middle picture that you see on the second row is a picture which happened in Lod. Lod, the city where our airport is Israel, a city in pre-1967 borders, a city which is in the complete consensus in the international community. Of course, we believe that also Judea and Samaria is part of Israel, but we're talking about complete consensus. But it has also an Israeli Arab community. You can see over there this Israeli Arab that's in the middle of riots. As you can see, there's also fire around. You can't see the crowd, but the crowd was very massive over there. In the middle of riots, goes up, takes down the Israeli flag, and puts up a Palestinian flag. This is one of the things that we've seen, that it's not only in Jerusalem, it's also happening in Israeli Arab cities or in Israeli cities with Arab populations. The next picture, I'll go to the left. You can see a Gemara that was burnt. There was a school and a yeshiva that were burnt in Lod. And what is called in Israeli media, I haven't seen it in international media, but it actually is accurate in Israeli media to call it a pogrom. It's nothing less than a pogrom. the Arabs in Lod basically rioted and started burning. There's also pictures of stores with crashed glasses. You can have another picture of a burnt school that I'll show later on. And this is something that happened. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in this slide is the picture on the right. We already spoke about it at the beginning, the rockets that started going to Israel. They reached Jerusalem. None of them reached Jerusalem. Most of them stayed in the south. Right now, last time I checked for going on this webinar, there were over 450 rockets that were sent, that were thrown to Israel. That's a huge number for the past 24 hours. This is another picture of Lod. I do have to say that there's more pictures of Lod for some reason, but these same things happened also in Ramleh and in other cities with large Arab populations in Israel. And so it's not only unique to Lod. This is the picture that I promised of the school that was burnt down. And there's also a yeshiva that was burnt down. So as I said, over 450 rockets since yesterday. You can see a picture of the damage done by one of the rockets. Unfortunately, 2 people already died on the Israeli side, 2 women that passed away in Ashkelon. Ashkelon is the hardest hit city right now. Today, the Hamas, in order to test our limits, decided to also try something new, and they threw over 130 rockets in 5 minutes in order to test our defense systems. And this is this is the point where the Iron Dome didn't work as well. The Iron Dome that knows how to intercept rockets, and 2 people died at this point. And so this is basically where we're standing right now. We spoke about different areas which have all become interconnected in this conflict. If usually we can have a conflict which is focused in Gaza, or sometimes tensions in Jerusalem, or sometimes riots in Israeli Arab towns, you can really see that this conflict, one of the things that is unique about it is that you have Jerusalem, Gaza, and Israeli Arabs all partaking in it. And you also have the question mark of whether Judea and Samaria will take part in it. And when we look at the reasons, then you'll also see that Judea and Samaria is part of the reason for this conflict. So I spoke a lot about the fact that we'll speak about the reasons. So now this is what we're going to do. We'll discuss how this all started. I'm going to start, first of all, I have to say before I start going into the actual reasons, there's a lot of different reasons that all join together into a perfect storm, and they aren't necessarily connected one to the other. So I'll go through all of them, and then we'll look at a full map of all of them together in order to try to understand correctly. The first reason, or more, I call it an excuse why they started the violence, because as you'll see, there isn't an actual legal reason to their claims. But the first reason is because of what's happening in the neighborhood that the Arabs call Sheikh Jarrah. It's a neighborhood in Jerusalem, a neighborhood that before 1948, there were both Jews and Arabs living in. And the buildings that we're speaking about, that we'll speak about right now, were owned by Jews since 1875. In 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel, the parts of Jerusalem went under Arab control, and those parts became empty of Jews because the Arabs didn't allow, the Jordanians didn't allow any Jews to live in these areas, and so the Jews were expelled from these buildings. In 1967, when Israel regained control to these areas, court cases afterwards found that these buildings actually did belong to Jews, and therefore that they should be under Jewish control. Now, what's interesting is that the courts in Israel aren't exactly very right-wing. They're actually quite to the left. Even when they gave this so-called right-wing decision, which is actually just a fact, a legal fact, they still said that the Arabs should be considered protected tenants. And so the thing is that they refused. They didn't want to pay rent because they didn't want to admit to owners the buildings could actually evict because of the fact that they didn't want to pay their rent. And the final Supreme Court decision is expected, was expected any day now. The government actually asked for the decision to be only in another month and not right now in order to lower the tensions. That didn't help. the current situation and the tensions that we're seeing right now is in many ways a way for the Palestinian, for the Arabs living in these areas to try and bully Israel to allow them not to pay rent on these apartments that are actually Jewish owned. So this is the first reason. I'm going to the next reason, which, as I said, is not necessarily connected, but we'll see that there is a connection. At the same time as this was happening, then there was a new anti-Semitic trend in the Israeli Arab areas all around Israel. The trend is what we call the TikTok terror. TikTok is a social media platform where you can put up very short videos. And in this platform, young people like to have some challenges where they challenge each other to do things. Usually it's that are fun, dances and things like that. But Israeli Arabs decided to make a terror challenge. In other words, they would find a Jew, they would hit him, slap him, whatever it is, film it and put it on TikTok. Not only is this disgusting and anti-Semitic and reminds the worst times of Jewish history, and you can see these pictures and it really reminds us of these times, this also incites more and more hate because this is how social media works. The more you see hate, the more you want to be part of it. And so this happened in Israel, and it was something that we had to deal with. At the same time, the PA elections were supposed to happen, and Mahmoud Abbas decided, because he realized that he couldn't win the elections, that he wanted to cancel the elections, or he calls it postponing the elections. Obviously, it means to cancel it, and he blamed Israel for it, saying that the reason why he's postponing the election is because Israel is not allowing voting to take place in East Jerusalem, in the eastern parts of Jerusalem. Now, this is a ridiculous claim because anyone living in East Jerusalem could go a few minutes out and vote in another ballot. We don't want election offices in land which belongs, which is a part of our Jewish capital, United Capital, which we believe is part of our eternal capital. And so anyone could have gone a few minutes out and they could have voted, but this is just an excuse. Now, Hamas, who was competing against Abbas, said that it holds Israel responsible and that it will and that Israel will have to pay consequences for this action. Again, all of this is theater, but it's another way for them to justify the reasons why they're attacking Israel by saying Israel is not allowing us to have an election, which isn't true, and therefore we're going to attack Israel and we're going to hold it responsible. This, by the way, is also part of their election campaign because attacking Israel is a good way to be popular with their base. Another thing that happened at the same time is Ramadan in Jerusalem. We're in the middle of the Ramadan, and every single year, Ramadan is a very tough period for our security forces. We highest, they never get to the level that we've seen in the past few days, but we also sometimes have some terror attacks during these days. This year, because of all of the other things that were going on, and because the Hamas also saw a interest in getting people mad and in inciting violence, then the violence was much more felt during this time. And so you also have that we have to deal with. And Ramadan and the Temple Mount are two sides of the same coin because one of the reasons why Ramadan is so tough to deal with in Jerusalem is because you have a lot of Arabs that come from all around Israel and Samaria to Mount during this period of time. And you can't always know what their intentions are. They come to pray. Some of them come to pray. Others, as we've seen, come to incite hate. And you know they're coming, and Israeli policy is to try and allow people to come and pray. We can argue whether this is the right policy or not, but that is the current policy. So we've seen all of the different reasons. We've seen the Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood, we've seen the TikTok terror, we've seen the PA elections, and then we spoke also of Ramadan in Jerusalem and the tensions on the Temple Mount. These basically explain what happened in the last few weeks, which basically burst in the last day, yesterday, which was also, by the way, Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, a day where we ironically we celebrate the liberation of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, we've seen that we still have a lot to do in order for Jerusalem to be really free of incitement and of attacks against Jews. But yesterday was also Jerusalem Day. So I want to speak about the way Israel dealt with the situation. I'm going to try to be as objective as I can without necessarily giving my opinion, just in order to give you the facts, even though I imagine that you'll be able to hear when I think that the decision was a bad decision. But Israeli decisions yesterday, again, Jerusalem Day, Yom Yerushalayim, we're celebrating the liberation of Jerusalem, which happened in the 6-Day War in 1967. A lot of Jews wanted to go up to the Temple Mount yesterday morning. And the Arabs threatened that if the Jews go up to the Temple Mount, then they will attack them. I'll say a small disclaimer. I was supposed to also go up to the Temple Mount yesterday in order to pray and in order to celebrate the fact that we are not to pray. Don't quote me on saying praying, because you're not allowed to pray on the Temple Mount according to the law, which is ridiculous, but you're allowed to go up. And so to go up and to celebrate the fact that we're allowed to go back up. And I wasn't allowed to go up. This is me, and there were hundreds of other people that wanted to go up and weren't allowed. The decision to close the Temple Mount was basically, the logic behind it, according to Israeli authorities, was that maybe if we appease them, they'll stop the violence. In the afternoon, by the afternoon, Israel realized that the violence was continuing. Now, one of the things that happens every single year on Jerusalem Day is that there's what we call the flags dance. So basically, it's a dance that goes through the old city, through Damascus Gate, through the old city, up until the Kotel, and celebrates Jerusalem Day. Quite a few hours before the dance was to take place, not even a few hours, about half an hour before, Israel decided not to allow the dance, the parade. I think parade is a better word. The parade to go through the old city, and rather through Damascus Gate, and rather they would go through Jaffa Gate, which is closer to the Jewish quarter, in order not to create problems again with the Arabs, and to hope that this will lend to less violence. Again, this didn't happen. A few hours later, at 6 p.m., the rockets started from Gaza. The violence continued in Jerusalem, and right after that, the violence continued. The violence started in Lod, Ramle, and in Arab towns around Israel. And so again, this appeasement didn't work. I also going to say that there's also another decision, which is for security reasons, that there's no schools in the south and in the center of Israel. Now, since these decisions, which were more of the type of appeasing, since then there were other types of decisions which were done today. First of all, Israel has started targeted killing of high-level terrorists in Gaza. We're going to see in the next slide, maybe I'll even show it right now. We can see the pictures of 4 top-level terrorists that were already killed. This is a big achievement for Israel because they're not easy to find usually. Usually, by the time the rockets fall on Israel, they're already in their bunkers. And early on, we've already been able to eliminate some very serious enemies of the state of Israel. And so this is a big achievement. Right now, at the same time as we're speaking, the Israeli army is calling in reserve soldiers. I can tell you personally that I got a call from my officer who told me to be ready. I wasn't called yet for reserve duty, but he did tell me just be ready in case we need you. And so this is something which is happening right now. It's still unclear whether this is done in order to deter Hamas in Gaza, in order to tell them that we're being serious and that we're taking this seriously, whether we're actually going into a long-term operation in Gaza. That's still unclear, but definitely this is one of the options on the table. At the same time, then we can see that artillery is ready on the border of Gaza, this is usually a sign that things are getting more serious, because artillery is usually used in order to allow for foot soldiers to go in afterwards. You start with artillery and then it allows to go in. Again, unclear whether this is in order to deter Hamas or whether it's an actual something that's going to happen in the next few hours or days. And we have a lot of Air Force and Marine activity from the IDF. Now, I want to go into a few myths and facts, as I told you, and then I'll end with this and we'll go to questions and answers. Sorry. The first myth that I've heard is that the reason for the violence is Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day. They basically say if the Jews didn't want to go up to the Temple Mount, if the Jews didn't want to go through Damascus Gate, they didn't threaten us this way, they bother us this way, then there wouldn't be any violence. This is completely false. We can know, first of all, that it's completely false because Jerusalem Day has happened every single year since 1967, and this has never happened. The second reason is that the violence started way before Jerusalem Day, the way we've seen it today. Now, the third reason is that you can see, this is a picture of the Temple Mount before Jerusalem Day, and you can see how the Arabs on the Temple Mount collected rocks and created these areas from which they could throw rocks at soldiers, at Jews that come up to the Temple Mount, etc. You can see that this was premeditated. It's not something that was instant and not premeditated. This was planned and premeditated, and they were getting ready to throw these rocks before the actual Jerusalem Day started. The second thing is that you can hear in some media, you have here Al Jazeera, but to be honest, you can also hear it in the Western media. Maybe I should have put here a picture of Western media, that Al-Aqsa Mosque was raided. Now, the truth, this is what they say, and then they say Al-Aqsa is so important to the Muslims that you can't expect them to just sit them and do nothing. This is the way they say it. Now, the truth is that you can see, again, pictures inside of Al-Aqsa of rocks being accumulated in order to throw at Jews. And so the truth is that what started the response of the Israeli forces against people throwing rocks from Al-Aqsa is this. It's the fact that they tried to attack us from Al-Aqsa, and we cannot just sit by and let them attack us. So again, you see that this is a type of disinformation where they try to show as if Israel raided the mosque from its own will, when we see that it was really an attempt to defend ourselves against attackers. The other thing is that, again, you can they speak about illegal settlements, and they speak about Sheikh Jarrah, and which we call Shimon HaTzadik. We already saw that, so I won't go back into the details, but this is a complete myth. Legally belong to the Jews, not only because of historical reasons, not because of international law, but even recent illegal decisions by Israeli courts, which again, Israeli courts usually aren't considered very right-wing, they're considered very left-wing. So if an Israeli court says that this belongs to the Jews, it probably belongs to the Jews. These were the three myths that I wanted to discuss. Now, the last slide that I want to see with you is really what to expect now. There's nothing really to show here. We spoke a little bit about the fact that right now Israel is showing signs that it's taking this seriously and getting ready for a serious operation. We don't know right now if this is where it's going or not. I tried getting more information right before the webinar, but there's still no information. And so we'll have to wait and see where this turns out. But it's important for us to remember when this is getting more and more intense, how it all started, because there's a trend that usually at the beginning, it's clear that Israel is defending itself, but then very quickly, the world see that Israel is stronger. Thank God we are stronger. And because we're stronger, they point fingers at us and they show us as the attackers. But chronologically, this isn't true. It's not because we're stronger that we're the attackers. The Hamas was looking for a fight, and we're defending ourselves, and we'll defend ourselves successfully, please God. And so it's important to remember these things. As you can see, we were planning on discussing the election results. I think that right now it's better not to. If people want to discuss them in the questions and answers, then I'd be happy to. But I think that now is a good time to open up for questions. Alan.
Okay. Dan, first of all, thank you so much for that detailed analysis. I didn't expect different. You did not disappoint. There are many questions. There are two things that I think I'd like to just put out first. I believe I overheard in your presentation as I was trying to monitor the questions that you reported that there were no fatalities, but I believe there were 2 fatalities in Ashkelon.
Yeah, I know I did mention 2 fatalities in Ashkelon. Yes.
Okay, great. That's one. And just as a matter of fact, Dan, can you tell us, maybe it's an estimate, what the total number of missiles fired from Gaza has been? Because we're seeing all kinds of reports here.
The last report I saw before this webinar again, and I imagine that it's already higher, was over 450.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we're going to cut to some questions that I've taken out of the chat or the Q&A. As part of ZOA, Dan, you and our listeners know that we've taken a very strong position exposing Biden appointment to Israel. Can you speak to the sentiment in Israel about Israeli confidence in the commitment of the United States to Israeli safety?
First of all, Israel and the United States have common interests, and I believe that this doesn't necessarily change with the new administration, and we as Israel need to know how to work with any administration that comes. That being said, right now there is a big question that we do not know how the Biden administration will respond to the current attacks. It's a big question mark. If it will let Israel do what it needs to do in order to defend itself, or if it will try to stop Israel very quickly, I would even say too quickly. And that if we stop Israel too quickly, what happens is that we don't have the time to regain our deterrence, and then we aren't able to do the work that needs to be done, and then more conflicts happen. That's basically what happened. So the question mark on the Biden administration is existing, and no one really knows how to answer that, because it's the first time that really put the Biden administration to test, and it will be a big test for the Biden administration.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Hey, Dan, just please confirm that you can hear me, because as I warned everybody, we were in the middle of a new modality, and I got kicked out of the webinar. I had to pull myself back in. So you hear me well?
Yes.
Fantastic, thank you. Dan, from our perspective, would you speak to the selection of military targets? It seems that our enemies are often picking civilian targets, and we believe that the IDF is more cautious and careful. Can you talk to us about that from your spot on the ground?
Yes. Yes, I'll be happy. I'll just say in passing that, as you said in the introduction, I also advise the Army on international law, and so I know this very, very well. The big difference between Hamas and Israel is that Hamas targets civilians and tries to kill as many civilians as possible, and the only reason why they don't manage to do so is because because of the Iron Dome, because the civilians stay in protected areas, because we defend the civilians. In other words, their goal is as many civilians dead. Our goal is as little civilians dead. We want to try to attack targets that are valuable targets, but that are military targets. And yes, they include people. As you can see, targeted killings I discussed, and I see it as a very big success that we get to higher ranking people, but they try not to include civilians. Sometimes civilians get caught in the crossfire. This, according to any interpretation of international law, is to be expected and is not something which is, but the responsibility is on Hamas's hands. It's not on Israel's hands, because we do everything we can in order to limit the number of civilians that die.
Thank you. Dan, are there any moderate Israeli Arabs speaking out in support of Israel defending herself?
So there are, I think we need to take a few seconds just in order to specify some things related to that question. One of the big questions actually when it came to making a coalition for the elections was whether to include a certain Arab party which presented itself as more moderate and more focused on civilian issues and less military issues. This party has still not gone out and condemned the actions, not of Hamas, not the riots, and not the different riots both in Jerusalem and around Israel. It hasn't said a word. This is one of the reasons why the general feeling is that that coalition that was supposed to be established will not be established in the end, because we've seen now that they call themselves moderate, but they're not moderate. Now, that being said, I do want to say that there are Israeli Arabs all around Israel that as individuals are pro-Israel. They exist. There aren't many, but they do exist. They speak out for Israel in social media and things like that. The problem is that they're not elected, and so we don't really know how much power they have in their community. They might be lone voices, probably, unfortunately, are lone voices. And so we don't know how much they represent a general feeling. The hope that we had for a moderate, the hope that some people had for a moderate Arab party that would join the coalition, now we see that they're not moderate at all. They were just faking to be moderate in order to get into the coalition.
As a follow-up to that, Dan, has there been any reaction yet from the Gulf states, those who have joined in the Abraham Accords?
Early on, I heard the Gulf states asked for Israel to be careful on the Temple Mount, which is to be expected. I mean, even if we have an agreement with them, it doesn't mean that they end up being 100% pro-Israel. And they did do something which, to be honest, European countries do much worse. So I'm not so mad at them for it. But they've been mostly silent right now and haven't used a lot of diplomatic pressure in order to pressure us into not defending ourselves. Again, the same way that I said that this is the Biden administration, this is also a test for these agreements, because it's the first time that we have real tensions since these agreements.
All right. I don't think we should be guilty of making assumptions. So somebody posted a question that's actually fairly interesting, Dan. He asks if the Jewish property owners in the areas of conflict, and could you please share the Hebrew name of that town, have they been asked to present deeds of ownership?
Yeah, there was a whole process in court in order to really show that this really belonged to them, and the courts decided for them. And so the whole process, the whole legal process happened. It's 100% agreed that according to Israeli law, again, I imagine that there are some Palestinians that don't care about the law and that will say it doesn't belong to them. But according to Israeli law, it 100% agrees that this belongs to them. And again, there are deeds from before Jordan expelled the Jews from there that show that ownership. And so that ownership returned to them after 1967.
Very, very interesting. Somebody also asked if this is new technology where rockets reaching Jerusalem, is that new, or is it something that they've just restrained themselves from using? We haven't seen that happen very much in the past.
So again, it has happened in the past, not in these numbers. What has happened in the past few years, Dafka, because of the hit that there was on the Gaza front in the past few years, this is given to the Hamas to actually accumulate weapons. And so it's not necessarily that they have higher grade weapons or more sophisticated weapons, but they have more of them. And so if they used to have only 2 rockets that could get to Jerusalem, now they have dozens of them, and they use dozens or hundreds, I'm not sure exactly, but they use 7 of them yesterday because they don't feel that they have to be as careful as they once did.
Okay. I'm gonna roll 2 questions into one, Dan. You spoke a little bit about artillery building up. We know that you got your preliminary call up to Miluim. So here's 2 questions. One, how close do you feel the Israeli government is to regarding this as an actual or how close are we to war? And ZOA National Board Member Len Getz asks, at this point, does Israel have a specific objective to achieve in Gaza?
Len's question is a great question. First of all, for the first question, the feeling is, the general feeling in Israel is that this is going to be a long story, and so I don't want to be a pessimist here, but it's that it's not going in the right direction. But in the past, I have a friend that's a war strategist, and he once told me that when people say that things are going to go bad, usually it means that things are going to go well. In other words, war usually surprises you, and when everyone is careful, then usually conflict doesn't happen. And so now that the conflict already has started, I don't know if this is still true, but the general feeling is that this is actually going to be longer. Now, when it comes to strategic goals, when it comes to Gaza, one of the big criticisms that people have about Israel's relation to Gaza in general is that no clear long-term strategy has ever been established. In other words, it seems that Israel has accepted the fact that we will have these types of conflicts once every 2, 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it is, and just to hope that the length of time between the different conflicts is as long as possible. But there's no strategy to actually end the conflict over there. One of the reasons, people might say that the reason is because there can't be a strategy conflict there. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's probably what some of the people that are for this strategy would say. So the strategic goal in this context is always to try and hit hard in a way that Hamas will remember for a long time, so that the next conflict happens as far away as possible. So right now, this is the strategic goal, and that's why we go to high-level people and try to do some targeted killings against them in order for Hamas leaders to understand that their lives are on the line. That's why we also hit their homes and things like that, in order for them to understand that their personal homes are on the line, so that they feel it close to home, and so that they are deterred for as long of a time as possible. But when it comes to a long-term strategy to end the conflict, unfortunately, I don't think there is such a strategy right now in Israel.
Would it be unfair to regard this as a possible intifada, like a new iteration of an intifada?
It's too early to say, but it's definitely one of the possibilities. And let's put it this way. When you asked about, are we going into an all-out war, my answer was mostly focused on Gaza. If the conflict continues also in Israeli cities, and if Judea and Samaria also wakes up, then more of an intifada-like atmosphere might really come. I will say that right if I came on this webinar, I saw on the news that the riots yesterday, there's some Arabs that were killed in the riots while they were rioting. And so in their funeral, they started again rioting. Israel has put much more police forces today in Lod in order for these riots to be short and not for them to continue all night long like last night. I don't know what will happen. I've been in the webinar since then, so I can't update you. But this is a big question. Are these things going to go on for the next few days? If they do go on, then it seems that they're going to also escalate.
And you know that here at ZOA, we're taking a very, very strong position in trying to keep Iran non-nuclear, to get in the United States not to re-enter the JCPOA. Knowing that Iran is a very bad actor, that they're attacking American ships, is there any inclination in Israel that Iran is helping to foment this ire and anger and this most recent series of attacks in Israel?
There is no question about that fact, because Hamas is Iran. Hamas is sponsored by Iran. In the past, they've had some arguments with their bosses in Iran, but they're funded by Iran. They're the long hand of Iran in the Palestinian territories. And so when Hamas does something, and this is being led right now by Hamas full force, and so when Hamas does something, it means that Iran is doing it also. And so while they're not on the front lines and they don't show their faces, their effect is being felt definitely.
Right. There's a question here that we've already answered, so I'm going to skip that. Dan, what can people on this call do to help you from an Israeli perspective?
So first of all, the most important thing is really to learn the facts. And as I said in the webinar, to remember also as this conflict plays out, how it started, and to be our spokespersons wherever you live, whether it's letters to the editor, social media, or even speaking to your friends at work, whatever it is. A part of our challenge in Israel is that, again, I'm not saying whether this is justified or not, but it's a fact that it happens, is that when international pressure, Israel usually stops its military acts. And so the more time we have to do what we need to do, the better it is. And when you fight for us, wherever you are, in order to make sure that our positions are heard, then this helps us have more time to do what we need to do in order to defend ourselves. And so it's very important to put the truth out there.
Dan, let me follow up with one more question, then I'll ask you to close, and then I'll close it. I think I'll close the meeting because there are so many. ZOA National Board Member Cheryl Silver asks a great question. Do you believe Israel currently has enough Iron Dome missiles to repel this attack? Or will the new ambassador have to ask for U.S. Congress in helping acquiring more missiles quickly? And to that, before you even answer, I asked you a question a moment ago, which you answered so well. To those on this call, absolutely be sure to connect with your local lawmakers, Congress people, senators. But Dan, why don't you answer so that we have your perspective?
Can you just go over the question once more? I didn't hear the beginning of it.
Sure. Do you believe that Israel currently has enough Iron Dome missiles for this current action?
So we had a big test for that this morning. As I said in the presentation, Hamas tried something new. They sent more than 130 missiles in 5 minutes. Think about it, 130 missiles in 5 minutes to Ashkelon. And their goal was to test the Iron Dome. Now, the Iron Dome did well, relatively, but 2 people got killed in this attack. And so it didn't do perfectly. I'm not an expert in the technology in order to be able to tell you whether more Iron Domes would be the solution here or not. To be honest, I'm not an expert, but we do see that there are flaws with the current situation. I don't know, again, if it's something which has to do with the technology itself or if we need more missiles.
Thank you, Dan. Hey, Dan, would you like to offer some closing thoughts before I close the program?
I'll just say that I want to thank you for listening. And I want to all of you also not to worry about us. We're very strong in Israel. It's true that there are a lot of conflicts here, but we're strong and we're optimistic. And when we need to defend ourselves, we know how to defend ourselves, and we'll do whatever is needed. So while all of this presentation was pretty negative, I'll end with a positive note, not to worry too much, and we'll stay strong here.
Well, Dan, thank you for your comprehensive analysis. It's been amazing. Thank you for dispelling the lies and myths, for sharing truth with us. I know you're scheduled to bring your next webinar in the series in early June, but if we need you, I know you'll be there, and we can bring one a little bit quicker to make sure that our followers are caught up to speed. To everybody on the call, especially if you live in Israel, know that we at ZOA have you back. Dan, we're not afraid for you. We know that you're safe and that you're going to protect yourselves. But ZOA and our followers will never compromise our belief in Israel's sovereign rights. If you live outside of Israel, if you have family or friends in Israel, call them, tell them you're thinking about them, that you appreciate the risks they and their families take and their sacrifices, and tell them that you know they have truth on their side. Be vocal about the truth. The world needs to hear your voice. Write to your local lawmakers. Tell them that Israel has the right to defend herself. Write to your newspapers. Buy Israeli products. All of these things make a difference. In these difficult times, you need to know that ZOA's work is exploding. Help us fight the enemies of Israel and the Jewish people. Help us keep Iran from achieving military nuclear capability. Help us fight the false narratives of the hostile to Israel Biden appointees. Go to our website now, ZOA.org, and please make a generous donation to the ZOA. We need your help. Wishing safety and peace to all. especially to our brothers and sisters in the Jewish state of Israel, this ends our program.